Welcome to Dreamers and Disciples. It is so good to be back. The podcast has been on a bit of a hiatus over the summer. In fact, I took a longer break than I originally anticipated, but it ended up being a great summer, a great time with family, really rewarding times of ministry over the summer as well, and just a lot of space to seek God about this next season of life and ministry, and to also get a new vision for this podcast. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine. He's one of my best friends. His name is Stephen Webb. You know him on the podcast as Sweb. I've talked about him before, but we were talking about just the things that bring me life and energy and joy. And he said, I think the thing, as I'm watching you from the outside in, that you have the most fun doing, at least from his perspective, he's like, I think it's the podcast. And the more I thought about it, I agree. I think this is what I really love doing the most. There's a lot that I enjoy doing, but I have a lot of fun with the podcast. I love connecting with this community. I love learning from my guests, and I'm excited to do a lot more of that in this season. So Dreamers and Disciples is back. And as I was planning on what this first episode back should be about, and I was sitting down to kind of bullet point out some things I wanted to talk about, it hit me that this would release a year to the week that my first book, This Dream Is Not For You, released. So that released last September on September 12th. And so now that book, that dream of mine, has been out for a year. So I thought it could be fun just to get back into the flow for our first episode back and just talk about some of the things that I have learned since not just writing that book, but releasing This Dream Is Not For You. And this isn't just about what I've learned. I actually think all four of these lessons apply to any area of your life where you are trusting God with a dream, or where you're trying to build something new. You're trying to bring a vision to life, and you've got a lot of expectation. You have prayed a lot of prayers. You've dreamed some pretty big dreams. And then what does it look like as you actually step out in faith and release it into the world? And so we're going to talk about that through the lens of what I've learned through my book, but I think it's going to help you in whatever that area is in your life right now. Now, in the future with this podcast, we're still going to do a lot of interviews, a lot of conversations. In fact, I have a dream of even this podcast, not just releasing episodes once a week, but maybe twice a week, maybe a conversation with someone else for one episode of the week, and then maybe a shorter, just personal episode like this. And so one of the ways that I'll do that is by building up this podcast community also over on my Substack. So this summer, I started a Substack where I'm sharing a lot of more candid and personal thoughts about ministry, about leadership, about following Jesus. And I think it's the perfect companion to this podcast. In fact, I'm going to start releasing bonus podcast content over on Substack. So when I interview a guest, I'll probably ask them a question just for the Substack community. Or I might go into a deeper dive into something that a guest said or something that I wanted to talk more about on the podcast, but I didn't want it to go too long. So all of that is going to be over on Substack. Specifically for my paid subscribers over there, it's only $8 a month. And so as I continue to build out this community, one way that you can support it, if this is something that actually gives you life, if it energizes you, if it helps you in any way, go over there and become a subscriber on Substack. You can be a free subscriber. I'll release periodic free content over there as well. But the good stuff is going to be for those who invest as little as $8 a month over at Substack. Plus, before I get to what I learned after releasing This Dream Is Not For You a year ago, I thought it'd be fun to celebrate by giving away 5 signed copies of This Dream Is Not For You. So you can win one of those copies. Even if you have the book already, it'd be a great way to share it with someone else. Just subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Subscribe to the Substack. It can be the free subscription as well. It doesn't have to be the paid one. And then share the podcast on social media. If you do those 3 things, which are all very simple, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the Substack, and then share on social media, this episode, then I'll pick 5 different people and I will send you a free signed copy of This Dream Is Not For You. So it's my gift for you. It's a way to celebrate the 1-year anniversary, the 1-year birthday of my first book. Here it is right here. This Dream Is Not For You. All right, well, let's get to the 4 lessons that I've learned in the last year. Number 1, just because I wrote the book doesn't mean I graduated the class. Just because I wrote the book doesn't mean I graduated the class, or you could say it doesn't mean that I learned the lesson once and for all. I've told a couple people this over the last year. You better be prepared to live out the message that you write about. And if you're going to write a book called This Dream Is Not For You, I've learned you have to be prepared to surrender that dream to God too. So I want to read you something that I wrote on page 72 of the book. This is in the chapter Dream with Open Hands. And it's a short little section. But I wrote, I currently have a new dream of writing a book. In fact, if you're reading this now, you are seeing the reality of that dream come to pass. In writing this book, I've had to come to terms in my heart with the fact that even if no one ever reads it, the dream wasn't a failure. It was enough to reflect on the journey God has taken me on and write down what I've learned, giving these 50-some thousand words back to Him as an offering. It might seem like a subtle perspective shift, but for me, it has been quite significant in keeping my heart free of judging the merit of a dream by earthly metrics of success. It is also true that some dreams are meant for smaller audiences. Not every book is meant to be a bestseller. All right, so it's one thing to write that in the process of writing the book. And writing the book was definitely an experience of worship, of realizing how present God has been with me and our family in our journey. And I really did mean that when I was writing it, that even if it wasn't a bestseller, like this whole process has been a spiritual experience drawing me closer to God. Now, when you release the book, at least for me, there's still a big part of me that wanted the book to be a bestseller, that still wants the book to be a bestseller. I believe that there's a lot of good in that desire because I believe in the message of the book. I believe in what it testifies about the faithfulness and the goodness of God and how He can be trusted. I want a lot of people to experience that message. At the same time, it can be very disappointing when something that you work so hard on doesn't hit certain metrics that you've prayed for or that you've hoped for or that you've dreamed for. And so while this book has done well, for me being, at least in my vantage point, being a first-time author, and while I've heard many, many amazing, encouraging testimonies from people who've been helped by the book, it did not reach any bestseller lists. It did not, go viral in any sense of the word. At least not in the first year. But a lot of times people tell you that, the lifespan of a book, the first year is the most important. And so I had to wrestle with the words that I wrote there about, okay, God, whatever you choose to do with this, whoever you choose to help, that's enough for me. It's not to get accolades. It's not to get applause. It's not to get recognition for myself. It's actually meant to honor you and to help people. All the episodes of Dreamers and Disciples where I've talked about that, everything that I write about in the book, I had to walk through one more time if I really believed that. And there were days where most of my heart believed that, and then some of my heart was really having a hard time reconciling it. There were other days where I would watch other authors who had released their first book, and it seemed like it was succeeding at a level that this book was not. And I had to wrestle with everything that I write in the book about championing other people and realizing that I can be excited for someone else living in the dream that I wanted to be living in. So in a way, it helped me relearn all the lessons that I wrote about in the book. And sometimes I feel like in our Christian life, that can feel discouraging. Like, I feel like I should be past this by now. I feel like I should have graduated this class. But spiritual maturity, I'm learning, isn't linear. It's usually cyclical. It usually feels like You're going around the same lessons over and over and over again. And I remember Pastor Stephen, when I was on staff at Elevation, which if you've listened to this podcast or you've read the book, you know my story. And one of the things that he would tell us a lot is that not to get discouraged when it feels like you're circling the same issue, but to look at it like you're ascending a mountain and you're like driving around a mountain to the top. And yes, you're circling around the same thing, but you're circling around it at a higher level. And so, yes, I am still wrestling with a lot of the same issues I wrestled with in the stories that caused this book, that set this book in motion. But I've learned so much since then about God's faithfulness. I've learned so much then about how to pivot from striving to surrender. And it gave me a chance in a lot of ways to put this book into practice and see that, oh, it's not just for other people. I'm not the professor here. I am still a student learning at the feet of Jesus. And this book is just meant to be a guide for me as much as it is for anyone else. So I think that helped me realize that in every dream, we need to continue to stay humble, continue to stay open, continue to revisit lessons that we might have thought that we have previously graduated from. So that's the first lesson that I learned. Number 2, you have to guard your gratitude. That's actually a chapter title in the book, Guard Your Gratitude. And I tell the story in that chapter about how when my twins, I believe it was their 8th birthday, and once again, I tell the story in the book about how the twins were born 3 months premature. Liana had a grade 4 brain bleed. They told us she would never walk or talk. They gave us an incredibly devastating diagnosis, yet she ended up doing everything the doctor said she wouldn't do. Like, God performed a miracle in all 3 of my daughters' lives. But I remember it was the 8th birthday for Liana and Adley, the twins, and Liana still had weakness on her right side. She has hemiparesis, which is like a mild form of cerebral palsy. So she had to walk with a leg brace. And I tell the story in the book about how she was running at her 8th birthday party in the backyard, and Adley and the rest of their friends were running ahead of her, and it looked like Liana was lagging behind. And I was having this conversation with God, this little personal pity party, where I was asking the Lord, it's like, God, why does she still have to struggle like this? Why can't she keep up with the rest of the kids? And, you know, a lot of this came from a really good heart of a father of wanting what's best for your daughter. But at the same time, I had grown accustomed to everything God had done in their lives, every instance of how they were the exception to the rule, how they were the miracle. They were living out everything the doctor said they would never do. And I felt like the Lord in that moment said, you realize that she was never even supposed to walk. And now you're complaining that she's not running as fast as her sister. And that stopped me in my tracks. And I realized that I had been so grateful for a miracle 8 years ago. And now I had grown accustomed to that miracle, and it had become common to me. And now I was even starting to let a seed of bitterness take root in my heart. And it just reminded me that in every season of life, we are living in dreams that we once prayed for. And it's easy for us to always think of the dreams that aren't realized yet, of the unmet expectations that are out in front of us, that are in the future. All the while, we lose sight of the miracles that we are living in right now, the answered prayers that we are walking in right now. And so life is this constant balance between dreams that are realized, that we're actually walking in, and then dreams that we're hoping for and praying for. And in the middle of that, there's also the disappointment that dreams that didn't work out. But our heart is a mixture of exceeded expectations from God, and then expectations that we're still holding loosely before Him and praying for. And I just want to remind you, what I've had to relearn myself is that you are living in the reality right now of something that you once said would make you happy. You are living in the reality right now of something you once said would bring you joy. That if this happened, then I would feel like I'd finally accomplished whatever that is, that you would feel like your life had meaning. You would feel like your life had significance. And what that ultimately brings me back to is that my meaning and significance and contentment and joy can't rest in an event. It can't rest in a series of circumstances. It has to rest in something deeper, something that is not so fleeting. It has to rest in the love and the grace and the power of my Father in heaven. And He knows what's best for us. He is the giver of all good gifts. And as I am working towards something new and hoping and dreaming and praying for something new, which I think is important as humans, it keeps us moving forward. It keeps us stepping out in faith. It keeps us trying to bring new aspects of God's kingdom to life in this world. As we're always looking forward, we can't lose sight of the good things that God has done in the past and the reality of His goodness that we're living in the present. So we have to guard our gratitude. If we don't actively guard it, it will leak, it will wane, it will fade. And one of the ways that I'm learning how to do that in this season, and it's really, really simple. It's most days starting my day with writing out 5 things that I'm grateful for that the Lord did the day before, or that I'm anticipating God doing that day. It keeps me on the lookout for God's goodness. So I strongly encourage you to institute a gratitude practice. It's been so easy for me. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see I have a stack of books back there. It's easy for me to just walk into my office every single day and not realize that those books are evidence of a dream that used to seem so far out of reach, that used to seem like something I could never do. And now it's on my shelf. It's in people's hands. It's actually helped people. I have boxes of them in my garage that I take when I go to preach. And it's so easy for me to get used to the fact that I got to share my story with people and God has used it to help them. What dream, what reality of God's goodness are you living in right now that you are taking for granted? Institute some type of rhythm in your life to help you guard your gratitude. All right, here's the third lesson that I've learned in the last year, or a lesson that I've relearned, and that is the importance of pivot practices. The importance of pivot practices. If you've read the book, I talk about how to pivot from striving to surrender. Pivot from striving to make your dream happen at all costs, to, break every door down, to try to make things happen in your own strength, to try to manipulate circumstances, to try to manufacture momentum, and just to take your life into your own hands. And the purpose of this book was really to help me and to help you have rhythms in our lives where we can pivot our heart from that posture of striving to a posture of surrender, of surrendering our life, surrendering our dreams to God, no matter the cost, no matter what Jesus is asking us to lay down, no matter what He's asking us to take hold of. And it doesn't mean we work less. It doesn't mean we lower our level of expectation or belief. It doesn't mean we stop dreaming. It just means that as we are working hard and as we are moving forward, we're open to what God wants the dream to become. We're open to the redirection, the interruptions, the surprises that God has in our way. We are open to even how we can turn the disappointments into something beautiful in its time. Maybe not, it doesn't seem beautiful in the moment. Maybe it's extremely painful and devastating, but we trust that God can work all things for good according to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So I've learned in this season how the pivot practices weren't just exercises for the end of every chapter. I've learned how to actually anchor those in my heart and use them in my life in a different way. And I can't tell you how many times this year I've had to stop myself and just pray, okay, God, I know I'm striving right now. I know I'm trying to make this happen on my own. Help me to surrender this to you. And sometimes I would even just from a physical posture, I would move from clenched fists to open hands. And just that language of pivoting from striving to surrender has become a very, very common and helpful prayer in my life. I'm learning to recognize my tendencies towards striving quicker. I'm learning to know what it feels like more in my heart. And I'm learning how to find ways to just shift my focus, to pivot my attention, to go on a prayer walk just to clear my head, to send somebody an encouraging text when I'm feeling jealous. I'm finding ways to redirect the momentum of my heart. And if the momentum is towards striving, I'm learning new ways that work for me to pivot my heart more towards surrender. So what can stop your spiral of striving when you start to go in to that spiral? Are you finding ways to pivot your heart to surrender? And how has this book maybe helped you do that? Because it's helped me, even as the one who wrote it. And a lot of these practices came from what I was doing in my own life. They continue to work themselves out even now. So once again, you don't graduate this class. You're constantly relearning these lessons. And I think you're also learning in your own spiritual walk what rhythms help you in different seasons of your life and how those rhythms need to change and how they need to recontextualize in different seasons. And so for right now, I'm not going through every single question at the end of every chapter, but just different phrases, different language, the disciplines of directing your awareness and your applause and your anticipation in the Guard Your Gratitude chapter. Those have all been helpful pivot practices for me as well. There's 3 questions in the book that I've talked about in here before, but in delay, what can you develop? In defeat, what can you discover? And in discouragement, what can you display? Those have been helpful pivot practices for me, once again, to move from striving to surrender. So the importance of pivot practices has been a huge, huge help in this season. And then finally, the 4th lesson is God will use your hard season to help others. And it's a simple statement, but I wanted to end on this one because I really want to encourage you. Because when I was going through the seasons that inspired this book, when Ferris and I, my wife, were in the hospital rooms begging God to save our children, begging God to heal our kids, when I was walking through really painful transitions of letting certain aspects of my dreams and the things that I love doing in ministry go, I never imagined that God would allow me years later, over a decade later, in some instances, to share those stories in a way that would help people who are going through the same thing. I never imagined that those seeds that were sown in the soil of pain would actually bear fruit in the lives of other people and give them hope and comfort. And I got to see this in a tangible way because a lot of times with a book, somebody gets a book, it takes them a while to read it. And I've been blessed to get a lot of stories and a lot of testimonies back. But I got to see this firsthand in the spring and early summer where my wife and I, we led a book study on this book with an organization called Hope Kids, with the chapter here in Charlotte. And they help families who have special needs children. And that's always been a passion for my wife and I. And so we got to go through this book and then walk through each chapter, each section with these families who had walked through and were walking through really difficult situations with their kids. And the dreams that are the closest to you are the dreams that you have for your family. And as a parent, especially the dreams you have for your kids. And those can be the most painful ones when you are facing disappointment and when you're trying to learn how to trust God with your child. And to see how the Lord was using Adley's story and Liana's story and Sydney's story in the lives of these families and how God was encouraging them was such a blessing to me and a reminder that nothing is ever wasted. No pain that you go through right now is wasted. It's very real to your Father. And He can use that pain. He can use what you glean and what you gather in seasons of suffering, and He can use that to bless other people down the road as you can stand before them and say, even in my darkest hour, God never left me. Even when it felt like all was lost, God's hope and his love and his grace and his comfort still remained. And it's there and it's available for you, not to offer easy answers, but to offer your life as a testimony that God is with you, that God is for you, and that God loves you. I've walked through so many lessons with worship leaders and people in ministry this year who are trying to learn what it means to surrender their gift to the Lord, to surrender their future, to maybe let go of a past season and walk into something brand new that might be a little scary. And I can offer them hope that, hey, your best days are not behind you. They're actually in front of you. And so be expectant for what the Lord wants to do. And so I say all that just to remind you that in Revelation, when John is writing about the martyrs and he says that they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Your testimony, your story has power. What God has done in your life, what God is doing in your life, God can use that in ways that you could never imagine, in ways that you could never expect. Maybe it's too painful right now, but I promise you one day in the future, at some point, you are going to be able to help someone else who is struggling with the very same thing that you have come out the other side of. And so I just want to tell you and challenge you today and honestly speak over you. Be a good steward of your story. Don't take your story for granted. Be a good steward of your story because your story has power when God is at the center. It might not be in a book one day. It might not be on a podcast, but your story is meant to impact someone else. You have a whole sphere of influence, a whole circle of people that God can change through your story of his faithfulness in your life. So how are you sharing it? How are you stewarding it? And how are you using it to serve other people? All right, those are the 4 lessons that I've learned in the last year of This Dream Is Not For You being out. I'll just go over them really quick again. Just because I wrote the book doesn't mean I graduated the class. So just learning how to continue to humble myself and learn lessons that God has taught me in the past, but at a deeper level, or circling it from a higher vantage point or perspective. So don't get discouraged when you feel like that. Be encouraged that God is getting that lesson deeper into your heart. Then the second lesson was learning to guard your gratitude. How can you actively create a gratitude practice in your life and never lose sight of the dreams that you're living in now as you continue to dream new ones for the future? Then third, just learning the importance of pivot practices. How can you continually find ways to pivot your heart from striving to surrender? And then finally, how can you steward your story? Because God will use your hard season to help others. So I hope this was encouraging for you today. If you haven't gotten the book, This Dream Is Not For You, you can get that pretty much anywhere books are sold. I'll have the link in the show notes. And also remember, I want to give away 5 signed copies of the book. So if you subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the Substack, and then share the podcast on social media, I'll pick 5 people who do those 3 things, and I'll send you a book from me. So I'm excited to bless you with that. And I can't wait for everything that's headed our way in the next several months of Dreamers and Disciples. It's so good to be back. I'll see you back here next week.